My Aquarius boss thought he was untouchable, but I outsmarted him in front of everyone. The Seattle rain was a constant companion in 2004, a soft, persistent drumbeat against the window of my Queen Anne apartment. Every morning, I, Sarah Jenkins, 31, would wake to its rhythmic cadence, dress in sensible business attire, a tailored skirt suit, a crisp blouse, and make my way downstairs. My small kitchen, with its chipped ceramic mugs and the scent of brewing coffee, was my sanctuary before the daily plunge into the corporate world. I worked as a senior marketing strategist at Pacific Ascent Marketing, a firm nestled in one of the gleaming glass towers downtown. The commute, a brisk walk to the bus stop on Queen Anne Avenue and then a 20-minute ride through the bustling streets, offered a quiet transition. I'd watch the city lights shimmer on the wet pavement, listen to the low murmur of conversations, and mentally tick off my day's agenda. Pacific Ascent was a dynamic place, or at least it had been. For 3 years, I'd poured my ambition and analytical mind into the company. I was known for my thoroughness, my ability to untangle complex data, and my knack for crafting compelling narratives that resonated with clients. My current magnum opus was the Evergreen Initiative, a comprehensive, multi-phase marketing strategy designed for Cascadia Tech Solutions, a burgeoning software giant looking to redefine its public image. I'd spent 9 months on Evergreen, meticulously researching market trends, developing innovative campaign concepts, and building a granular execution plan. It was my baby, conceived in late-night sessions, fueled by cold coffee and the quiet hum of my desktop computer, nurtured through countless revisions, and now, finally, on the cusp of presentation. It was poised to be the biggest client win in Pacific Ascent's history and a cornerstone of my career. My office, a small but functional space overlooking Elliott Bay, was a testament to my dedication. Stacks of research reports, meticulously organized binders, and a whiteboard covered in flowcharts and sticky notes all pointed to a mind deeply engrossed in its work. I thrived on the challenge, the intellectual rigor required to piece together a coherent, impactful strategy. Colleagues like Mark, a fellow strategist, and Lisa, from Creative, often sought my input, valuing my logical approach. My best friend, Emily, a sharp-witted software engineer at a different firm, was my sounding board outside of work. We'd meet at the Pike Pub or Belltown Billiards to decompress, trading war stories from our respective tech and marketing trenches. Life was structured, predictable, and professionally fulfilling. Then Arthur Vance arrived. He strode into Pacific Ascent like he owned the place, a self-proclaimed visionary with a perfectly sculpted haircut and a smile that promised much but delivered little. His resume, we were told, was impeccable. A string of successes at boutique agencies on the East Coast, a reputation for being a disruptor. He was brought in as the new director of strategic accounts, my direct boss, supposedly to streamline operations and inject new energy. Arthur, an Aquarius by his own frequent, unsolicited declaration, fit the stereotype of the detached intellectual, charmingly eccentric, brimming with ideas, but often emotionally aloof, believing himself above the mundane realities that governed lesser mortals. He had a way of speaking in grand, sweeping statements, peppered with management jargon, that often obscured a lack of concrete detail. Initially, Arthur seemed impressed by my work on the Evergreen Initiative. He'd sit in on meetings, nodding sagely, offering a vague commendation here and there. "Excellent foundational work, Sarah," he'd purr, his eyes already scanning the room for more important people. But the compliments soon faded, replaced by something insidious. He started subtly appropriating my ideas in team meetings, rephrasing my points as if they were his own spontaneous insights. He'd ask me to brief him thoroughly on sections of the Evergreen plan, only to present them himself to upper management just days later, omitting any mention of my contribution. My initial unease grew into a knot of anxiety. I started documenting everything, not out of paranoia, but out of my ingrained habit of meticulous record-keeping. Every email, every draft with revision dates, Every meeting agenda I had prepared, every raw data analysis spreadsheet, all were carefully archived on my local drive and backed up on an external hard drive, time-stamped and categorized. It was just how I worked. The moment of truth arrived on a Tuesday, a day steeped in a thick, Seattle fog that seemed to mirror the dread pooling in my stomach. The Cascadia Tech Solutions presentation was set for 10 a.m. in the firm's state-of-the-art conference room, a sleek space with panoramic views of the city skyline, usually reserved for the biggest deals. I had been preparing for this day for months. My presentation deck, a masterpiece of design and data visualization, was loaded onto the system. My notes were perfectly arranged. I wore my lucky navy blue suit. The Cascadia team, including their CEO, Mr. Donovan, and their head of marketing, Ms. Chen, were already settling in. Mr. Harrison, Pacific Ascent's executive VP, was also present, his presence underscoring the importance of the deal. Just as I was about to walk to the podium, Arthur clapped me on the shoulder, his touch surprisingly firm. "Sarah, a word," he murmured, pulling me aside. His smile was dazzling yet chilling. "I've decided to handle the main presentation today. You can assist with the Q&A, provide support as needed. It's a high-stakes meeting, and I think it's crucial for the client to see direct leadership from my level. You understand, don't you?" My breath caught in my throat, my mind raced. "But Arthur," I stammered, "I've prepared everything. This is my project. I've lived and breathed Evergreen for months." His smile didn't waver. "Precisely why your expertise will be invaluable during the questions. Think of it as a strategic delegation, a chance for you to observe and learn from a different perspective." He gave my shoulder a patronizing squeeze. "Now let's not keep our esteemed guests waiting." He didn't wait for my response. He simply turned and walked confidently to the podium, taking my spot. I was left standing there, frozen, the blood draining from my face. My carefully constructed world seemed to splinter around me. Humiliation, hot and searing, washed over me. I wanted to scream, to object, but the room was already filled with expectant faces. I forced myself to walk to a chair at the back, feeling every eye on me. The irony wasn't lost. The architect of the Evergreen Initiative was relegated to a silent observer of its theft. Arthur began. He spoke with his usual flourish, his voice resonating with false confidence. He clicked through my slides, explaining concepts that I had painstakingly developed, using phrases I had coined. He never once looked at me. His performance was slick, practiced. He sounded impressive, even brilliant, to those who didn't know the meticulous work that lay beneath his polished delivery. A few times, he stumbled over specific data points or technical nuances, moments that I could have effortlessly navigated. But he quickly recovered, using vague generalizations to gloss over his lack of detailed knowledge. Cascadia Tech's team looked genuinely impressed. Mr. Donovan nodded approvingly. Mr. Harrison beamed. Then came the Q&A. Ms. Chen, Cascadia's head of marketing, asked a nuanced question about the projected ROI for a specific digital campaign phase. Arthur, clearly out of his depth, paused, then glanced vaguely in my direction. "Sarah, you've been working on the granular projections for this. Perhaps you can enlighten Ms. Chen on the finer points of the statistical modeling." It was a trap, a public dismissal. He wasn't asking for my input. He was throwing me a bone, a tiny sliver of responsibility, while simultaneously implying that the finer points were too detailed for him, too beneath his visionary scope. I walked forward, heart-pounding, and concisely answered Miss Chen's question, providing the exact figures and the methodologies behind them. As I finished, Arthur interjected smoothly, "See, Miss Chen? Sarah is quite good with the numbers. Attention to detail, that's her forte. Though sometimes, one can get lost in the weeds when they're not seeing the bigger picture, wouldn't you agree?" A snide comment, delivered with a charming smile, but loaded with a toxic barb. He had publicly praised me while simultaneously undermining my capacity for strategic thinking, painting me as a mere technician, not a strategist. It was a classic power play, designed to ensure everyone knew who was truly in charge, and who was merely a cog. The room chuckled politely. My face burned. My career, my reputation, my months of work, all reduced to a punchline in Arthur Vance's performance. I felt utterly gutted. The presentation concluded with handshakes and glowing remarks for Arthur. I faded into the background, a ghost at my own feast. I made it back to my office on autopilot. The moment the door clicked shut, the facade crumbled. I ripped off my jacket, threw it onto my chair, and slumped onto the floor, pulling my knees to my chest. The carefully contained rage, the crushing humiliation, exploded. Tears streamed down my face, hot and furious. I wanted to break something, to scream until my voice gave out. This wasn't just about a stolen project. It was about the public assault on my professional identity, the blatant disregard for my effort, the contempt with which Arthur had treated me. I stared at my reflection in the dark computer screen, a distorted, tear-stained face staring back. Was this it? Was I just going to let him get away with it? Quit. The thought gnawed at me. Quitting meant he won. He'd continue his charade, walking over others untouched. The next few days were a blur of numb despair. I went through the motions at work, a zombie at my desk. Food tasted like ash. Sleep offered no escape, only restless tossing and turning filled with replays of Arthur's smug face. Emily called me every evening, her voice a lifeline. "You can't let him do this, Sarah," she urged, her usual calm replaced by a fierce protectiveness. "He's a parasite. You worked too hard. You're too good." Her words slowly began to chip away at the despair. Rage, cold and precise, began to replace the raw pain. I spent an entire Saturday holed up in my apartment, staring at the rain-streaked windows, a cup of untouched coffee growing cold beside me. I pulled out my external hard drive. Every draft, every email, every data analysis, every meeting note. I scrolled through months of meticulous work, seeing my own digital fingerprints on every single component of the Evergreen Initiative. I remembered the long nights, the moments of breakthrough, the pride I had felt. And then I remembered Arthur, the casual cruelty in his eyes as he dismissed me, the sheer injustice of it all. He thought he was untouchable. That was his fatal flaw. His arrogance blinded him. He believed his charisma, his connections with people like Mr. Harrison, insulated him from consequence. But I had something he didn't: integrity, meticulousness, and an unwavering commitment to the truth. And I had his own overconfidence as my weapon. Arthur was a talker. He liked to brag, and in his bragging, he sometimes revealed too much. I started thinking about Project Nexus, Arthur's other supposed masterpiece. Nexus was a highly confidential, technologically complex endeavor that Arthur had taken over shortly after his arrival. He constantly boasted about its innovative nature, its potential to revolutionize client engagement. But I'd overheard whispers, fragments of conversations, that suggested Nexus was a mess, behind schedule, and far more complex than Arthur let on. He'd mentioned, almost offhandedly, relying heavily on a brilliant external consultant for the technical heavy lifting. This struck me as odd. Why would a visionary like Arthur, brought in for his expertise, need so much external help on a project he was supposed to be spearheading? My meticulous nature kicked in. I discreetly accessed the company's internal document repository, something anyone in my position could do, and searched for anything related to Project Nexus. I cross-referenced dates, project codes, and personnel assignments. What I found was a patchwork of vague reports from Arthur, juxtaposed with extremely detailed, highly technical documents from an external vendor, Synergy Solutions Group. There was a gaping chasm between Arthur's general updates and the vendor's precise, technical progress reports. It looked like Arthur was merely a conduit, funneling the vendor's work as his own without truly understanding its intricacies. This wasn't just incompetence, it bordered on intellectual dishonesty. Then, a specific company policy clicked in my mind. Pacific Ascent had a stringent intellectual property and collaboration guideline, particularly concerning external contractors. It mandated clear communication channels, strict oversight, and, crucially, that all proprietary elements developed by contractors specifically for Pacific Ascent projects must be explicitly documented as company intellectual property, not just licensed. It was a dry, legalistic document, but essential for protecting the firm's assets. I remembered Arthur, in a casual team meeting weeks ago, dismissively waving off a question about this policy regarding Nexus, saying something like, "Oh, they're just consultants, it's all handled. No need to get bogged down in bureaucratic minutiae." His words now seemed incredibly reckless. I also remembered Mr. Henderson, a senior compliance officer at Pacific Ascent. He was an old-school professional, gruff but scrupulously ethical, known for his encyclopedic memory of company policies and his deep-seated intolerance for corporate shortcuts. He was the kind of man who ate rules for breakfast. He'd been with the company for 30 years and had seen countless rising stars crash and burn due to arrogance or cutting corners. If anyone would notice a breach, it would be Mr. Henderson. My plan began to form, a slow, methodical unfolding in my mind. I wouldn't confront Arthur directly. That was his game: open conflict, public shaming. I would use his own arrogance, his reliance on superficial appearances, and his disdain for detail against him. My revenge wouldn't be a dramatic outburst. It would be a quiet, surgical strike, using facts as scalpels. The perfect stage presented itself: the annual Innovation Showcase. It was Pacific Ascent's flagship internal event, where departments presented their achievements to the entire company, including senior leadership, key investors, and even a few prospective clients. Arthur, predictably, was slated to give a major presentation on Project Nexus, framing it as his personal triumph. This was my window. I started playing the long game. I became meticulously helpful to Arthur. I'd offer to proofread his memos, catching small, deliberate errors that I'd subtly point out, making him feel superior for correcting me. I'd ask him for guidance on minor tasks, feigning uncertainty, making him believe I was still shaken and had accepted my subordinate role. He visibly swelled with self-importance, convinced he had completely broken my spirit. This deception, acting like a defeated lamb, was perhaps the hardest part. Every "yes, Arthur" felt like a lie that choked me, but I knew it was necessary. My actual work, however, became even more precise. I compiled a comprehensive dossier. 1. All my original Evergreen Initiative files, time-stamped, including early drafts, research data, and email exchanges proving my authorship. 2. The company's intellectual property and collaboration guideline, highlighted with relevant sections. 3. Cross-referenced internal documents for Project Nexus, showing the disparity between Arthur's vague updates and the detailed, specific reports from Synergy Solutions Group. 4. Subtle hints from Arthur's own internal communications that suggested he was bypassing direct oversight on Nexus, pushing things through without proper review channels. I needed an opening, a trigger. I needed Arthur to trip himself up. During one of our helpful sessions, where I was supposedly assisting him with the Nexus presentation slides, I subtly, almost imperceptibly, introduced a small, yet crucial, omission in one of the technical summary slides related to data encryption protocols. It was a detail so specific, so seemingly minor, that only someone with deep technical knowledge would spot its absence. And more importantly, only someone without that knowledge would fail to address it properly. I knew he wouldn't verify it with the technical team. He'd just assume it was correct. This omission would force him, if questioned, to refer directly to the external consultant's original documentation, which, I suspected, contained the exact language that violated Pacific Ascent's IP policy. It was a tiny, precisely placed pinprick. The day of the Innovation Showcase dawned crisp and clear, a stark contrast to the gloom of my soul. The grand auditorium was packed. Arthur was in his element, holding court, basking in the pre-presentation buzz. I wore a simple, dark suit, aiming for inconspicuousness. I strategically placed myself in the third row, close enough to be heard, but not so close as to appear confrontational. I had earlier, under the guise of digitizing old records for internal audit, discreetly emailed the core elements of my dossier, particularly the IP policy and the discrepancy between Arthur's reports and the Synergy Solutions Group's actual technical documents, to Mr. Henderson's assistant. I knew Mr. Henderson was a stickler for details and would likely review it, even if just out of professional curiosity. I included a note saying I was simply ensuring all departmental documentation was in order. Arthur took the stage, projector lights illuminating his confident smile. He launched into his presentation on Project Nexus, a mesmerizing performance filled with buzzwords and grand promises. He spoke of innovation, disruption, and groundbreaking technology. He sounded brilliant, even if the actual content was largely borrowed. He clicked through the slides, including the one with my subtly crafted omission. He breezed past it, oblivious. Then came the Q&A. A middle manager asked a standard question about scalability. Arthur handled it with ease. Another inquired about integration with existing systems. Again, he navigated it, though with a slight hesitation that hinted at a lack of true understanding. Then Mr. Henderson, from his seat in the front row, cleared his throat. His voice, though quiet, cut through the hum of the room. "Arthur," he began, "on slide 17, you mentioned the proprietary encryption protocols developed for Nexus. My understanding of the internal IP guidelines suggests that such a core component, developed by an external vendor like Synergy Solutions Group, would need to be explicitly detailed in our internal documentation as company IP, rather than just licensed. Can you clarify the specific clause you're referencing that allows for this particular arrangement, given the sensitivity of client data?" The question was a precision strike. It wasn't an accusation, just a request for clarification, framed within company policy. But I saw Arthur's confident smile falter, just for a fraction of a second. He began to stammer. "Well, Mr. Henderson, the agreement with Synergy is quite comprehensive. It covers all eventualities. It's perfectly standard." "Standard, perhaps," Mr. Henderson pressed, "but our policy specifies explicit documentation and transfer of ownership for core proprietary assets developed on our behalf. We're not just licensing off-the-shelf software here, are we? This is fundamental to our service offering. Could you point us to the specific documentation where Synergy transferred full intellectual property rights for these specific protocols to Pacific Ascent?" Arthur was cornered. He couldn't point to it because, as my research had suggested, it likely didn't exist in the way Pacific Ascent's policy demanded. He had cut corners, relied on vague verbal assurances, or simply hadn't bothered with the detailed legalities, convinced his connections would shield him. His face started to flush. He looked increasingly agitated. He tried to pivot. "Look, Mr. Henderson, we're talking about innovation here, not archaic legalities. This is a game changer." That was my cue. I stood up calmly, looking directly at Mr. Henderson. "Excuse me," I said, my voice clear but not accusatory. "Mr. Henderson, I was actually reviewing some of the older project documentation this week, and I recall a similar situation years ago with the Project Phoenix initiative. The specific clause regarding external IP transfer was quite strict. Perhaps Arthur is referring to a more recent amendment to the policy, or perhaps the documentation is in a separate, secure repository." My question was framed as helpful, innocent even, but it served two crucial purposes. First, it subtly reinforced Mr. Henderson's point, validating his suspicion. And second, it reminded everyone that I, Sarah Jenkins, was intimately familiar with company policies and their history. More importantly, it put the ball back in Arthur's court: produce the documentation or admit noncompliance. It also planted the seed that if I knew this policy, why didn't the director of strategic accounts? Arthur's eyes darted to me, a flicker of raw hatred in them. He realized he'd been outmaneuvered. He tried to dismiss me. "Sarah, this isn't the forum for obscure policy discussions. We're talking about the future here. But isn't compliance with our IP guidelines part of securing the future, Arthur?" I countered softly, my tone still calm, reasonable. Especially when dealing with sensitive client data like Cascadia Tech Solutions. I subtly glanced towards Mr. Donovan and Miss Chen, who were watching the exchange with growing concern. They, as a tech company, understood the critical importance of IP and data security. The room fell silent. Arthur was losing control. He stammered, then, in desperation, tried to shift blame. Look, I delegated the specifics of that to the external team. It's their responsibility to ensure compliance. Delegation is one thing, Arthur, Mr. Henderson interjected, his voice now sharper, but accountability ultimately rests with the project lead, especially for a project of this magnitude. And particularly when the policy clearly states that the project director must personally ensure compliance and documentation. He then turned to Mr. Harrison, the EVP. Mr. Harrison, I believe we need to review the documentation related to Synergy Solutions Group's contract for Project Nexus immediately. This raises serious compliance flags. The dominoes started to fall. Mr. Harrison, his face now a mask of concern, nodded slowly. He had trusted Arthur implicitly, blinded by his charm and supposed connections. But Mr. Henderson, a man of unimpeachable integrity, had just publicly questioned the integrity of a major project. Then, Miss Chen, Cascadia Tech's head of marketing, spoke up. "Excuse me," she said, her voice cool and measured. "Mr. Vance, this discussion about Project Nexus's IP has raised some concerns. But I'm also curious, going back to the Evergreen Initiative, when we met last week, you presented it as entirely your team's conception. Yet Miss Jenkins here seems to possess a remarkable grasp of its intricacies, even the finer points, as you called them. Could you clarify the exact scope of her contribution to that project, given her apparent depth of knowledge?" It was a perfectly timed follow-up, a direct consequence of Arthur's earlier public dismissal of me. His casual barb had backfired spectacularly. Arthur turned bright red. He spluttered. Well, Sarah was integral to the initial data collection, but the strategic vision, the overarching framework, that was my team's. My team consisted of myself and a few junior analysts for data entry, Mr. Vance, I stated, my voice finally tinged with a quiet steel. The strategic framework, the core concepts, the detailed execution plans, and the entire presentation deck were developed solely by me over 9 months. I have all the drafts, email correspondences, and time-stamped progress reports to corroborate that. I didn't need to gloat. The facts spoke for themselves. The silence that followed was deafening. Mr. Donovan from Cascadia Tech Solutions looked from Arthur to me, his expression hardening. He had just witnessed the man who claimed credit for my work stumble and then be caught in a lie. Arthur Vance, the visionary, was exposed as a fraud, not just for the Evergreen Initiative, but potentially for Project Nexus too. His untouchable status dissolved like sugar in water. The consequences were swift and severe. The innovation showcase was abruptly cut short. Mr. Harrison immediately convened a closed-door meeting with Mr. Henderson, Mr. Donovan, Miss Chen, and me. My carefully compiled dossier, complete with every email, every timestamp, every detail of the Evergreen Initiative's development, along with the alarming IP noncompliance issues for Nexus, was laid bare. Arthur, when called in, crumbled under the weight of the evidence. His arrogance turned to pathetic excuses, then desperate blame-shifting. He tried to paint me as disgruntled, but my objective, detailed documentation was undeniable. Cascadia Tech Solutions, rightfully concerned about IP integrity, put their contract on hold. Within 48 hours, Arthur Vance was fired from Pacific Ascent Marketing, escorted out by security, his carefully constructed facade shattered in front of everyone who had ever admired or envied him. The official reason was gross professional misconduct and violation of company policy. The unofficial word traveled like wildfire. He had been a charlatan, exposed by his own hubris and the meticulous woman he had tried to sideline. The aftermath was a mix of relief, exhaustion, and a strange sense of vindication. Cascadia Tech Solutions, After reviewing my true authorship of the Evergreen Initiative and my role in exposing Arthur's negligence, decided to proceed with the contract, albeit with new safeguards. Pacific Ascent, chastened by the scandal, offered me a promotion to Director of Strategic Initiatives, recognizing my invaluable contribution and, more importantly, my integrity. I didn't gloat. There was no grand speech, no dramatic pronouncement, just a quiet satisfaction, a feeling of balance restored. The Seattle rain continued to fall, but now it felt like a cleansing. The only sound was the soft hum of justice, a melody I had composed, note by meticulous note.